are so thankful that you have decided to come to our workshop today on innovative peace building, conflict prevention, and rural development. I'm Yvonne Ladico, and the convener of the panel. My commitment to the goals of this program and to the conference in general stem in part from my own personal experience on 4 UN peacekeeping missions and having observed the necessity for the integration of peace building and conflict prevention. The order of the speakers is about the progression of the program. So we will begin with a more global perspective, general ideas, to a specific country assessment, and that country will be Colombia. Our topic envisions peace building as a holistic process which incorporates conflict prevention, addressing the root causes of a conflict. So to this end, it requires a strategy, especially rural development, that integrates the healing, empowerment, and transformation of women and girls. Our program is called Circles of Trust because peace requires trust building, and that trust requires the healing of the wounds of conflict, both visible and invisible. It requires empowerment, capacity building for well-being, and income generation, all leading to the transformation of lives, community, and the legacy of conflict. It is our true pleasure and honor to welcome our first speaker, His Excellency, the Ambassador of Thailand to the United States, Ambassador Verashai Plasai. I've had the pleasure to know Ambassador Plasai at the UN in several retreats, and it is truly a great honor that he has been able to join us today. Following Ambassador Plasai, we have Dr. Massimo Tomaselli, who is the permanent observer of international idea to the UN. He will speak about fostering inclusive civic engagement and local government, and especially taking into consideration SDG. SDG 16. Following Dr. Tomaselli, we have Mr. Robert Terry, who is the Executive Director of Merck Forest and Farmland in Vermont, and he will discuss program designed for transformational impact in the context of land management. And following those three speakers, or distinguished speakers, we will begin to look at the application of community agriculture in Colombia. Our first speaker and the application of land management. Our first speaker is Mr. Diego Garcia Deves, who is the Senior Program Officer for Global Drug Policy of the Open Society of Soros Foundation. He will discuss land management and active rural women's participation in drug cultivation areas. And following those speakers, we will go even further into Colombia, and we are so fortunate to have two distinguished speakers, our colleagues from Caritas Colombiana, who have come here for this conference.
I'm very sorry, I didn't get a chance to do a sound check. Everybody, please bear with me. We're having issues with the
Can people hear
microphone.
me?
Yeah, I'm trying.
So all this time you're talking. Okay. All right, so I guess last but not least, we get to hear about our last two speakers. And so our dear friends are coming from Bogota, Colombia, and the speakers will be Mr. Mario Pineda and Juliana Valderrama. They are practitioners in the field building peace with Caritas Colombiana, and they will discuss, Juliana will discuss the peace building projects and programs that she is working on, and Mario will discuss the Barometer project with the Kroc Institute, monitoring the implementation of the Colombia Peace Agreement. And after that, we will have open the floor for questions, and our speakers will have about 7 minutes each. So first, we are so honored, Ambassador Plasai, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Does it work? Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And the subject matter is something that is very dear to my heart. you will know why after the 7 minutes given to me has been used. Peace building is something that we have some experience with, mostly as a member of the United Nations and a country that is contributors to peacekeeping effort. And part of that peacekeeping is always our philosophy that we have to help the local people help themselves when the peacekeeping units leave the country. They must be able to have peace and must be able to develop themselves. So help them to help themselves, and underlying all this is a philosophy, a thinking given to us, invented by His Majesty the late King Bhumibol, who sadly passed away 2 years ago this month. And he came up with this philosophy, which is rather a way of thinking and a process of decision-making, which is called sufficiency economy philosophy. Despite the name sufficiency economy, it's a process of thinking. It's a way of dealing with problems. And it's based on, I'm being abstract, but then we'll be able to extrapolate this to a more practical terms. It's based on first reasonableness, whatever you do, reasonableness. Second, moderation, and then third, prudence. You apply these three elements, reasonableness, moderation, prudence, through your knowledge. You need to have knowledge, and you have to have virtue in that application. So this morning you woke up. Up to this point, you have had to make lots of decisions. Until the end of the day, you will have to make a lot of decisions. Some easier than, like, what you can have for lunch, but some more difficult. This philosophy will guide you through. And it can be applied to agriculture, it can be applied to government administration, business administration, but also to peace building. If you look at those three elements and how you apply them in peace building, you will see that at the end of the road, you can have self-reliance and you can have peace among the people. That's the first element that is underlying our philosophy of peace building. The second element we think is important, that is women empowerment, because in most of the societies where you need peace building, you see the need for women empowerment. And in my country, there is this idea of giving them supplementary occupation. So a foundation was set up a long, long time ago, about in the 60s, by Her Majesty the Queen, which is the mother of the present king, and she is still alive. And this foundation also, of course, is still alive. It's called Supplementary Occupation and Related Techniques, in short, Support Foundation. The idea is very simple. In the 50s and 60s, we went through a process of development, modernizing our country. And in that process, we lost a lot of traditional knowledge that we have had for more than 1,000 years. We're an old people. In that process of development, we lost all that traditional knowledge in textile, in food, in handicraft, whatever. People use plastic instead of traditional handicraft, for example. And so this foundation taught women in rural areas, mostly in rural areas, to revive those traditional knowledges and make a living or supplementary income out of that. And through 3-4 decades, it has worked very well. When women have job, they have a supplementary income, you see what the result is: emancipation and independence of women. And that is very important, because emancipation and independence of women socially is key to development and to peace. A third element, which I think would be appropriate in the context of Colombia, is what the UNODC, UN Office of Drugs and Crime, called alternative development, In Thailand, we used to call it crop substitution. It's very simple, but very difficult to achieve. In the 60s, His Majesty the late King, again, went up north and he saw that in the mountain areas, hill tribe people, they were living out of opium. They were planting opium and nothing else. And they sold that illegally, of course, to illegal factories to produce heroin. And no matter how you try to suppress them, they always a way for these people to do this. So His Majesty the King came up with this royal project called crop substitution, teaching them to plant something else because it's mountain area, so they can plant European vegetables and fruits and all that because of the climate is suitable. And so over 50 years, UNODC has now declared Thailand the opium-free. Production of opium or heroin is negligible in Thailand, non-existent, as a result of this. And it is called alternative development. And Thailand is willing to share all this with our friends, and we will share of G77, a group of 134 countries at the UN in 2016. And one of the themes was to help our friends in developing countries with this sufficiency economy philosophy, alternative development, and it worked quite well. We have developed cooperations with a number of countries through our cooperation arms, a Thailand International Cooperation Agency. The project is called SEP, Sufficiency Economy Philosophy, SEP for SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, because we believe that this SEP is one of the best way for developing countries to achieve the SDGs. So I'll stop at that, and I'm available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Massimo Tomaselli. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me once today.
Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you very much, Ambassador and fellow panelists. I will talk about inclusive peace building from the perspective of an institution like International IDEA, which focuses on democracy and electoral assistance. So for us, it is very important to consider the interlinkages between peace building and democratic processes. We produced last year a Global State of Democracy report that is available online and will update every second year. Last year's report had also a chapter that focused precisely on inclusive peace building. And I want to share with you three main points that emerge from that analysis. The first one is that the model of liberal peace building, which was linked to a vision that peacekeeping and peace operations would have supported democratic processes as a way to contributing to stability and sustainable peace, has actually produced mixed results in the post-Cold War period. In some cases, definitely it has contributed to that. In other cases, no. And there were also experiences of relapses into violent conflict. So there was a reflection on what was the key element that was not sufficiently taken into account in that period. And this was mainly inclusivity. In fact, even the high-level panel on peace operations called for, in 2015, inclusion and inclusivity as one of the main priorities in peace building. And for us, the three main elements that are important, looking at the intersection between democracy building and peace building in this respect, are, first of all, the nature, the inclusive nature of the processes that define the rules, the basic rules of the political game. In many cases, there are constitutional processes. Therefore, the nature of the constitution building processes is extremely important in order to capture the views and perspectives of all the actors engaged in the peace building process. The second element has to do with a specific aspect that is relevant to Colombia, which is the transition among the many multiple transitions that take place in a peace process, the transition of rebel and combatant groups into the political arena, often contributing by the creation of a political party. So this transformation, this transition of rebel movements into political parties has been actually analyzed over the last decades. Of course, there are many, many contextual elements that contribute to this transition in different ways. And even in Colombia, there have been previous experiences. If you think of the M19 or the ELN experience before the most recent experience that has to do with the engagement of the FARC in the political arena. So there are many, many lessons that can be learned from that experience. But one of the key points is, once again, inclusivity. The possibility of leaders of these formations to engage in a conversation in a public space is very important for allowing these actors to engage in a different way, in different terms, in the political conversation. On the other way, you have also the militants, the former combatants, who might contribute to a sort of democratic process within the party, if they are allowed to play that role. Otherwise, you would replicate top-down approaches that have been so important for the conflict itself. So that is the second message. And the last message has to do with the nature of the electoral systems, because there are incentives that are provided by different electoral systems to participation and representation, depending, of course, on the political culture. Any system can be, in a way, reinterpreted or manipulated, but there are some key elements of the system design that provide barriers or actually avenues for participation and inclusion. For a long time, there has been a consideration of the proportional representation systems as more conducive to representation also of groups that have abandoned the violent fight. But a more in-depth analysis of the experience in many post-conflict situations has shown that proportional representation may also provide incentives to strengthen extreme views and extreme positions in a post-conflict situation. And therefore, more recent analysis has taken into account the value of majoritarian systems in particularly in the function of appealing to creating positions that look at a moderate middle ground where a coalition can reach beyond the area of the militants. So the last message is that, in fact, electoral systems may play a role both in positive and in negative terms in a post-conflict situation, and there should be a consideration of the so-called preferential systems, known as centripetal systems, due to their aim to appeal to pull parties towards moderate and compromising policies. This is very important, and this is my conclusion, also in the perspective of SDG 16. The difficulty in SDG 16 analysis is normally that it is looked mainly in a national perspective. But for this type of reintegration and recovery post-conflict, there should be a consideration of the subnational dynamics. Therefore, how does these political dynamics work at the subnational level is the key issue that perhaps also the other speakers may address with respect to the economic basis, which is, I think, the third point that the ambassador recalled in his intervention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Massimo. Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Robert Turry.
guys hear me back there? So. Right here. How about now? Okay. So I said at the pivot point of our presentation. Still can't hear me? How about now? Third time's a charm. So I said at the pivot point of our presentation, and hopefully some slides will pop up in just a second, but where we're moving is from an international perspective down to a more local and strategic place, and tying into the sort of conceptual thread that runs through, or one of the conceptual threads running through the conference, I want to tap into just a little bit of how we stimulate innovative thinking. And one of the ways to stimulate innovative thinking is here not only from real relevant salient examples that represent a discrete body of related work, but also to think laterally. So what I want to have us think laterally about, just for a couple minutes today, are some programs that have been designed here that really focus on moving marginalized populations into conservation and working lands work. And over a series of about 10 or 15 programs and 15 or 20 years of work, what I've tried to do is just distill some lessons learned. So as we think about this broader global perspective and taking action in a very specific place, we have in mind some discrete lessons learned that may stimulate our thinking in a new and different way. I'm going to focus on programming that I hope aligns with the orange spaces on the diagram here, really that transformational experience, and then trying to move that transformational experience into something that's transferable to daily life in the long term. So for the nature of the programs that I'm going to talk about today, that transformational experience is a dislocating moment. It takes people out of their daily lives, moves them into a very different place. In that very different place, provides context, does some culture and community building work, focuses on personal reflection and technical skill development, and then once that experience has ended, there's a process of moving people into a next phase where they try and integrate those skills into really new workforce channels. And through consistent failure over time, found that there really need to be discrete programmatic elements that carry over through that span. So the three that I'm going to focus on today are direct transitional activities, cohort maintenance, and leadership opportunities within the system. Sorry, I'll go back for a second. The first thing I'm going to focus on is that transformational experience, that thing that dislocates people, takes them somewhere else, builds a new context, and in preparation for giving them an opportunity to try something integrative and new in their daily lives. We found it critical in these programs to find an inspirational anchor. The program that I'm going to talk about today, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, is the inspirational anchor for that program. It is the habitat of global significance that provides the context for the program. And the program that we're going to talk about focuses on moving young adults from mostly urban settings into a program that's designed to help diversify workforce for the national park system. So it's a workforce that at this point is about 85% white, so we're moving people from a very different environment and hoping to provide some opportunity and support through that transition so that there can be really successful career pathways. And one of the things that we found is critical from the very beginning, and this was a program redesign, was starting out by getting people really uncomfortable. The original thinking in our work was, hey, we've got to make this transition as easy as possible. The reality of the situation for us was the transition was never going to be easy ultimately, so if we addressed that difficulty in the beginning, we saw a higher retention rate. So we put people in uncomfortable situations and tried to find joy in those situations, and that was a big part of developing programs that had lasting impact. Building community is another key piece. At the outset of all these experiences, and what we typically found was that people would show up and they're overwhelmed because they're in a new space, they're in an uncomfortable space, and it requires a lot of direct facilitation in order to get people comfortable and engaged and willing to play along. A lot of that facilitation in the most successful programs has involved building community so that peer-to-peer leadership can emerge and direct sort of leader to member leadership can kind of wane. We found reflection was also a key part of this process. It's not enough to just build a community. It's not enough to have strong peer-to-peer leadership. As I mentioned earlier, the type of program we managed here ultimately led folks to a difficult transition. And if they didn't, from the very beginning, consider how that difficult transition would impact them, reflect on what that would feel like and what they would draw from to maintain resilience through that transition, we found that we'd lose them. So we had to embed reflection from the very outset, where people, really had dialogues with their future self, understanding that there were challenges coming and they'd need to find resilience in order to confront them. And of course, if we're moving people from point A to point B in a workforce program, we've got to develop technical skills. You've got to have the tools in your toolbox in order to effectively manage the challenges of day in, day out workforce reality and land management, so that you can find that early success that will, again, create an uptick in resilience. So when those elements were contained in that dislocating transformational experience, I've found that retention data and the likelihood of transition into workforce, into a positive outcome, was significantly higher. However, early on, the programs that I worked in didn't have a lot of these things, and they failed because of that. Later on, as we built these things, we were able to gain momentum and excitement, and then we'd cross that threshold. Eventually, that point-in-time experience has to end, and something new has to begin. And it's in that new thing where there's sort of enduring opportunity, and we were losing a lot of folks as they crossed that transition. They'd go back, they'd get started, they'd engage in, whether it was fisheries biology, whether it was farming. It's been a host of different land management outcomes, but they wouldn't always have staying power. So 3 things I found that can be built into that post-transition period if you've got this point-in-time dislocating experience in order to increase the likelihood of retention are deliberate transitional activities that combine those technical skills learned in the community of impact, cohort connectivity, and layered leadership. So this is an example of the type of transitional activity I'm describing. So this is a group of relatively young people who had come to one of those dislocating experiences. Maybe they'd gone to Alaska for a little while. Maybe they'd gone to the Grand Tetons. Maybe they'd been somewhere else where there's some sort of inspirational land base and learned from a bunch of professionals how to manage that land. Then they all went back to Chicago, which looks very different. So one of the things that we did with this group in an attempt to have a sort of transitional experience that would allow them to utilize those new skills back in sort of their present life was to work on a program called Hardencito, which was just basically before this group got started. This was an abandoned side lot in a neighborhood just outside of Chicago, overgrown, creating challenges for the community. By the time they were done, they'd partnered with an organization called the Friends of the Forest Preserve to bring in a lot of nature-based material that you can see here and created a natural play space and community garden. And in doing that, they were able to work with some of the folks that they had met, which was a transitional bonus. They were able to have impact in their community, which was a transitional bonus, understand like, well, how does this apply to me? I don't live in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, so here it is at home. And the other thing that we found was it allows them to build some social capital back in that community, so they become the people who transitioned or transformed what was a problem for the neighborhood into an asset. Another thing that's been critical is promoting cohort connectivity post-transition, so that dislocating experience happens and then people go away. That bond, although it dissolves in that point-in-time experience, it really helps retention if there are ways to maintain that bond. We've done it in a number of ways. Bringing people together physically, there's really no substitute for that when that can't be done. We do it digitally. We use any means of connection that we can just to keep people in front of each other so they have an opportunity to be reminded of that point-in-time transformational experience that had that positive impact or positive feeling, and tap back into that in order to help, really to help stamina. Because these programs were addressing challenges that were minor in comparison to some of the things that we're talking about, but that stamina is critical. The last piece that was really beneficial was fostering layered leadership. So the fellow on the right is the first African-American director of the National Park Service, Bob Stanton, who in our Park Service programs would always come. He would always show up, and it was critical for people to see someone they could directly relate to with a similar life experience, who had been successful in times that were even more challenging than theirs, and then to pass that leadership down. So we would always, in those point-in-time experiences, have a place, an opportunity for kind of multi-program generational leadership. People who had been through and been successful could come back and step into a leadership role, again, elevating that peer-to-peer component that we found to be so critical. So thanks for going on that lateral walk with me. We'll get back now as a presentation into more specifically what's happening in Colombia. And I would just encourage everyone to think about some of what you hear in the context of, if we had to build an on-the-ground program, what would it look like? What should we include?
Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Diego Garcia Davis. He is the Senior Program Officer for Global Drug Policy for Open Society, the Soros Foundation, and he will discuss land management and active rural women's participation in drug cultivation areas. Thank you so much.
Let me try to stand up. It's before lunch, and I don't want you to sleep. Thank you, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, for us, it's a great opportunity to look at the drug policy framework from the peace-building lenses. That's what we have been promoting over the last few years from the foundation. And I'd like to share some reflections about that aspect or that approach and some of the experiences that we have been promoting in Colombia specifically. So if we think about the drug policy framework, especially on the policies that are aimed to suppress the drug market, normally are addressing the symptoms and not the root causes of what's pushing communities to engage in illicit markets. So we normally see forced eradication driven by the security sector, leaving communities in further poverty or even more disenfranchised and not trusting the state. We also have seen excellent development, alternative development programs, but the core or the center of gravity of those programs are on the plants, on the crops. And again, these are just symptoms of complex situations in these areas. And we have learned that not only in Colombia, but throughout the Andean region and also in Southeast Asia, where opium poppy is produced. So again, our intent here is to promote the peace-building sector to make drug policy reform a core issue within their thematic areas. And to that aim, we thought that the peace agreement in Colombia was an excellent opportunity to learn from. It actually includes some provisions that allow us to test some of our hypotheses there. And I'm going to refer to three specific experiences that we had with women, and I have to apologize, I'm not man-explaining women coca growers. I'm just telling you what I have observed, and this is a self-critique. There should be a woman standing here and sharing her experience, but in the meantime, I'm just representing. So let's have a glance on how the coca communities or growing areas look in Colombia. 60% of those areas are facing monetary poverty. That's almost 20% over other comparable rural areas in the country. Almost 50% of those communities are facing multidimensional poverty. That's, again, almost 15% over the national average. I'll give you a fact that is somehow anecdotal, but it shows my point. Small farmers are normally an average of 5 hours from their farms to their closest urban or closest market. Coca farmers are at least 7 hours from their farms to the urban areas where they can commercialize their agricultural products. So this is already telling us and showing us where the peace building can insert their knowledge, their tools, their agenda, to sort of get out of that dilemma whether coca is a factor of instability in these regions or is multidimensional poverty. We argue that it's more the latter rather than the coca itself. So here are the examples that we have tried over the last few years. First of all, we realized that the peace agreement in Colombia was offering some provisions to test, and we pilot that in Antioquia, northern region in Colombia, with coca growing communities, in which they were allowed to comment, design, and actually input development programs. So we formed and we helped groups of women sitting in a bi-weekly basis in working tables to provide direct input to the rural development plan that was going to be implemented to reduce coca cultivation. Over a year, what we see now is that coca has disappeared from that municipality. UNODC certified the municipality as free of coca. What we're facing now is an increasing insecurity and risk of replanting because the state hasn't delivered and hasn't been present, so the state hasn't been built with the community again. So that's one example of what we've been promoting. An additional example is building the voices and recognizing the agency that these women are having. These women are facing a triple working day, not only dedicating their time to their field, but also looking after households. Women that produce coca in Colombia, amazingly, there are 40% of women that are household leaders within the community of coca growers. That's 20% over the average of farmers. So working with those women, learning from their experiences, recognizing their agency, it's a key aspect of success. So we decided to bring together not only Colombian women, but also Peruvian, Bolivian, and Thai women that have been engaged in illicit crops to share their experiences, build their profile, and in partnership with GIZ, we're publishing anytime soon a policy recommendation coming from these women. It's not the experts, us sitting here speaking on behalf of them. It's themselves who are recommending governments what to do and how to address these issues. And the last example that I want to share is a specific project that we've been supporting in Colombia with the National Learning System, SENA, in Cauca, in which we again departed the center of gravity from the coca field to help them learn how to use coca, the raw material that is used to produce cocaine, for illicit purposes. For the ones that don't know, coca can be used also, it's a traditional ancient plant in the Andean region that can be used to produce edibles, for instance. And we learned that these farmers could produce fertilizers as well, reducing their cost of production for their agricultural products and getting more income and promoting their leadership in their community. So again, our point is is working with those communities. It's listening to them directly. It's building their agency and recognizing the knowledge instead of criminalizing and stigmatizing farmers that are pushed to depend on illicit crops. And I'm looking forward for your questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is Mr. Gabriel Laser. He is an outreach coordinator and manager at the Food and Agricultural Organization, and he will have a slightly different view of peace and security, especially in terms of food amid conflict, and he also will speak about Colombia. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I come from this issue from two perspectives. One is from a global perspective and also from a domestic perspective as a UN agency. We are in over 100 countries And we also do believe that whatever is happening either in Colombia or in Syria or in Sudan or South Sudan or Nigeria affect the neighboring countries. So we have to look at this issue from both perspectives, the global and the domestic. So I'm going to give you 2, 3, or 4 numbers that kind of give you a big picture of what we're talking about. About 124 million people across 51 countries are facing food insecurity because of conflict and climate change. These are numbers that just came out from 2017 and 2018. And when you go even further from those numbers, 52 million children are malnourished, and 17 million of them are severely malnourished. Again, directly connected to climate issues, conflict, and fighting in some of the countries. So these are really tough questions that needs global solution. And we, working with many other partners, both from the NGO, from CSOs, from other multilateral organizations, are working on these issues. So for many people affected by conflict, agriculture is their only means of survival. And many conflicts affect rural areas' population severely. Such conflicts damage agriculture, disrupt food production. It also fuels plundering of livestock and crops. I mean, these are the exact things that poor people are depending on. And it causes the loss of income, specifically an area that women get affected mostly. As a result, the major drivers of food insecurity and malnutrition tends to be conflict. So for many decades, FAO has worked on 2 aspects of this issue, both from the humanitarian and from development side. And 3 things that we're really working to try to alleviate is to protect, save, and restore livelihoods. We're trying to reduce food insecurity and malnutrition, and to improve the resilience of livelihoods and agriculture system. And again, we're doing this both from the local, from national, regional, and the global level. I want to talk about maybe 4 specific areas on the global level that we're working, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 specific areas that we're working in Colombia. So from a global side, first thing that we're doing around building peace and ending conflict. One, we're working to build sustainable food security during conflict. And a big example of this is what happened in Syria. Even in times of conflict right now, 13 regions actually are producing enough food to feed their population, 13 out of 14. So FAO is directly working with smallholder farmers, providing seeds, providing technical assistance to help them grow food within their own area so they're not forced to move out. So that's one area that FAO is working to alleviate hunger in times of conflict. The second thing that FAO is doing in the same area, is to providing information for early warning. So we know there are always going to be global conflicts. We know there are always going to be issues of diseases around the world. So what institution could provide advanced knowledge to governments, to citizens, that there is a crisis coming that we need to deal with? The FAO plays that critical role. We also, and this is applied both from global and specifically to Colombia, we're supporting rehabilitation and reintegration. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So when families are affected by conflict, communities become resource poor, and they are forced to move. So we are really trying to make sure that people stay where they are and providing them the resources to be able to do so. And the 4th area we're doing is controlling diseases and contributing to peace. Again, when people cannot take care of their livestock, the likelihood of diseases spreading from one region to another is very high, and FAO is working in that area. So I'm going to talk a little bit specifically to what is happening in Colombia and what the FAO is doing in Colombia. So peace, rural development, and food security are at the core of the Colombia Peace Agreement, which was signed in 2016. And from a FAO perspective, we know that land control, agriculture practices, and livelihood have been strongly affected by the conflict that took place over 50 years. And we do believe that the success of the peace process depends on the support of the countrywide side, from the FAO working with the countryside, and to also helping with farming rights. I think that's one big issue that we're facing. as displaced communities are trying to come back to their land and former fighters need to be reintegrated into productive community, somebody needs to be there to support them, and the FAO is working that directly with the government of Colombia. So we at FAO believes that the peace agreement has direct impact on food security, rural poverty reduction, and the sustainable management of natural resources in Colombia. And we're supporting Colombia in a couple specific ways. One is we're carrying out comprehensive rural reforms aiming at strengthening the food security in Colombia. And we're doing so in four specific ways. One, we're working on land restitution and formalization, a big thing that was affected by the conflict. We're working to build nutrition and to make sure that nutrition systems are inclusive of everybody. And we're working to restore governance of natural resources that were destroyed during the conflict. One critical aspect of this is to make sure that the synergies between the social and productive and environmental policies are also always considered together. And we're doing so under a program called the Voluntary Guidelines for Responsible Governance of Tenure. And this is a program where we're advising the government and providing technical assistance to how to rebuild and provide the rights to people to land and ownership of land and access to forest and fisheries. And the second area that we're helping Colombia is to mobilize resources for the rapid response strategies. This is a government program that they launched in 2016. And today, working with the government, FAO has been able to create a trust fund of about $46 million, again, to help implement this program. And so we're also directly, and this is the third aspect of the work that we're doing there, we're working with Colombia to assess the coverage and functioning of social programs that have been destroyed during the conflict. So we know that the success of the peace process also depends on including those who are left behind, and I think some of the speakers here have mentioned. We believe that indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, young people, rural women's voice must be heard in the implementation of this program. We do believe that reducing armed conflict and extreme poverty have direct connection to addressing the consequences of conflict and ending hunger. And along the eradication of hunger, we believe that peace process is essential into reaching the sustainable development goals. So I thank you for giving me time to present a little bit from what FAO is doing, and I look forward to some of your questions. Thank you.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm working in the Barometer Initiative. That is a project that follow and monitoring all the implementation of the peace agreement. It's a project between Caritas Colombia and the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies from Notre Dame University. So in this couple of minutes, I want to highlight like two big advance of the implementation of the peace agreement and like the 5 challenges that we have, we still have. As you know, the first big advance, or the first big goal that we have achieved with this implementation of this peace agreement has been the ceasefire and the demobilization of all the FARC members, of all the ex-combatants, also the laying down of arms. We have like almost 7,000 ex-combatants have made the process of disarmament, and we have the United Nations mission have collected around now 9,000 weapons. So it's a very good relation between the number of ex-combatants and the weapons that United Nations collect in this DDR process. Also, the second big advance had been the creation of institutions, agencies, office, and all the institutional architecture to implement the peace agreement. So in this year and a half, we have created a lot of agencies that are going to implement all the programs and projects of that propose the peace agreement. But also we have a lot of challenges. The first challenge that I want to highlight is the the lack of warranties of security and protection of the communities. Since the peace agreement had be signed on December of 2015, 300 human rights defenders have been murdered in Colombia. So the number have raised in this year. The FARC is only one group in Colombia, one armed group, but we still have another guerrilla that is the ELN, and the negotiation with this guerrilla is blocked. And also we have criminal bands very linked to the narco traffic and all this. So we are still having very huge problems with the protection and the security of the communities. The second thing is about the reintegration. We already did all the reinsertion, all these measurements of the ID for the former combatants, the affiliation of Social Security, but we are still having problems with the reintegration that is a long process and specific in the productive projects of the former combatants, and also with the education of the former combatants. This is another big challenge. The third big challenge is the reparation of the victims. Colombia have 8 million victims of the conflict. That's a huge number, 8 million victims. And the purpose of the agreement, of the peace agreement, was to repair the victims. The center of the agreement was the victims, and we have seen that in these years of implementation. So now we have the system, the integral system of justice and trust running, but it's still missing. The victims don't feel the reparation. It's not coming, the reparation of these 8 million of victims that we have. Also, the rural development that is linked with all the illicit crops that already Diego had explained. This have a huge challenge in Colombia. One of the structural causes of the conflict was the rural development of the country. So we have to continue working in that. And the last one has to be we need more laws and more normative decrees to support the peace agreement, especially in the second point of the peace agreement that is about the political reform, and that proposed like a more democratic process in Colombia, what you have been saying about the new rules of the electoral process and the democratic process in Colombia. Okay, and finally, to finish, I want to invite you all you can download all the report. It's available in internet. You can see a state of implementation of the Colombia Peace Agreement, Krug Institute. You can download because it's a huge report. There are many things about it. And also invite you to this afternoon at 3:45. We are going to have another conference about the implementation of the peace agreement with in the whole academic hall C at 3:45. If you want to know more about it. Thank you.
Okay, thanks today. How are you? My name is Juliana. I am the manager project of Peacebuilding processes in Caritas, Colombia. Caritas is the social area of the Catholic Church in Colombia. We have a broad experience in the territory because we cover every inch of the country. Even though we have the priest in a really far away like jungle, it's part of our network in the territory. So we are the only actor that we have the confidence of every member in the territory, even though the legal actors trust on us, because we are in a Catholic church, in a Catholic country. In Colombia, we have different types of, in Caritas, we have different projects for peace-building processes. One project is the monitoring of the implementation of the Peace Accord. It's part of our projects. But also we have other projects that support the implementation of the Peace Accord and the transformation of relations into nonviolent relations to propositive and collaborative relations. We have a special methodology of how we work in order to transform these relations into propositive and collaborative relations. We have this strategy that consists in working with the communities in 4 different levels. The personal level of how a member that was part of the ex-combatants, maybe, or the community as victims, can be agents of transforming in their territory. That's one of our main work we have done. The other one is about the relational level, where we try to build cohesion, social cohesion between the parts. And this is like trying to, again, gain confidence. Most of the communities that receive ex-combatants are not trusted because they were victims of these armed groups. But in order to have an everlasting peace, we need to work in that. We need to recover and we need to build again these relations. So this main point is really important for us. How we can build and how we can structure new relations in order when we have been painful relations, we have been in a really conflict situation. The other one we have is how we can create a vision of community, a vision of community being broad, including the people that receive the ex-combatants, but also the people that are part of the community, the ex-combatants. So we start working with them in how they can dream a future. When we are in conflict, most of the communities lost the capability of dreaming because they only see their lives only 1 year, maybe, because they can be displaced, because they can be killed. Here in Social Pastorate and in Caritas Colombia, we work with that dream. We want to think about how they can change their lives in about 5 or 10 years. So every project we have this methodology. You have to dream first in order to have transformation in the territory. So in this level, we gather the mission and the vision of the community, but take into account that this mission and ambition has to be for 10 years, not only a year, 10 years. Here we include projects that are regarding, for example, of rural development, one of the main things we work here. Also, we work about how to give them access to basic services, the food, also we work with food processes, how they can be fed, because the land, and as our colleague from AVO say, the food is something important in our armed conflict. The land is something important, and it was the reason why the armed conflict was created in about 60 years ago. So we work in this level, and the other level we work is how this community can do advocacy in order to fulfill their needs in the communities. So every project we have these different 4 levels, and we have 3 good experiences right now regarding this. One experience we have is a project that we are working with civic agencies of United Nations, the government, and civil society, and we are working in 3 different components of 3 different levels. We are working in the first level, the transformation of relations. First one, because it's the only way we can have an everlasting peace. The second one are the small victories. They are giving them some productive alternatives in order to avoid being part of the illicit crops activities, or maybe they can go again to other illegal groups because they are unable to have economic fulfill in some way. And the other one is to give them basic services regarding education and regarding health. So we have these 3 biggest components that will try to create small victories in order to gain confidence. But when we gain confidence, we can work in order to transform relations. The other projects we have is how we can promote from youth, women, kids, victims, how we can give them initiatives for peace-building processes. So we have amazing experience in Colombia when some kids thought that they want to have some games in order to have to start linking some relations that they don't have with other members of the community. And these spaces have been really good because they feel empowered of their future, but also they have been transforming relations, and those relations that were broken, they have been built again through games. So that's one of our initiatives. And the other one we have is about illegal crops. We are working also in some projects with illegal crop substitution, but we are giving them alternative ways of doing economic development, rural development. We have some projects, for example, there are agricultural ones, the cocoa, the plantain, they are trying to do these projects, but also we have other projects of non-agricultural initiatives that are, for example, craftsmen, and we're doing alliances so they can build these products in other countries. So in social pastoral, we're trying to do our best, taking into account that we have all these huge challenges in the implementation of the peace accord, but also we have to take into account that's not only the Colombia peace accord with the FARC-EP. Also, we have a lot of other illegal groups that we have to fight in some way, and it's about working with peace processes that will be in the territory.
So we've had a chance to hear a lot of insight and practical experience from our speakers. We can, are there any questions or? Yes, we have one here and one there. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Rose Berger. I'm here with the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative. And we're looking at some moments in the Catholic Church to really use the infrastructure of the church to do what Juliana has just mentioned, but scale that up across every place where the Catholic Church has reach. And that's pretty much every place. And we'll talk about, we've got a panel this afternoon that I'd encourage people to come to. My question is about the early warning systems. I think it was you, Mr. Lazier, that talked about early warning systems, because I think that's something that Catholic dioceses are uniquely positioned to do, and I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about what that looks like.
Thank you all. My name is Sebastian Rodriguez. I'm with Accenture Development Partnerships, and we're working on a project in Colombia right now to try to get the private sector more engaged in peace building and trying to look at shared value and inclusive value chains. And one of the areas that we're really trying to focus is conflict-afflicted areas and the overlap of where coca production has been very high. And so my question is to the panelists that were speaking about that from a drug policy perspective, the shift in administration to really go towards forced eradication, also thinking of the fact that now coca production is, nearing an all-time high with more of the voluntary eradication, how to kind of reconcile those two, but then also thinking about the integral and holistic development in these areas if you're doing forced eradication with, crop substitution or non-agricultural products. And so how can different players contribute to creating the right ecosystem when sometimes the government might not be there in place to provide the effective infrastructure and stability in some of the forced eradication areas or some of these neglected areas? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the panelists. I'm Elvira Restrepo. I'm Colombian. I'm a professor at the George Washington University, and I've done a lot of research on the peace process, and I really appreciate everything you said. I just have two questions to the panelists. One is related to the new government. None of you mentioned that the new government was backed initially on a platform that didn't agree with the peace process implementation. So I want to hear your feeling in the ground of whether the new government is making it harder or helping or really neutral at this stage from your perspective. So that's my first question. My second question relates to the private sector. I'm very happy that you brought the question. There are lots of people that want to contribute to Colombia's peace, and lots of private companies, but they don't know where to go. Where should they go? Is there like a way to access it? And of course, I've been away for so long that I'm kind of more of a foreigner to my own country, so that's the second question. Thank you so much.
Okay, I think the first question was about early warning, and Gabriel, would you like to?
I actually had a feeling that question would come, so I brought my notes. So the IPC, no, seriously, I knew. The IPC is the system that the UN, all of UN uses to kind of classify where things are in a country at any given point. So this is called the Integrated food security phase classification. So there are 5 of them. 1, 2, and 3, things are a bit okay. When you start hitting IPC 4 and 5, that's when you know things are horrible. So IPC 4, severe lack of food access with excess mortality, very high and increased malnutrition, and irreversible livelihood asset stripping. So that is usually more of where South Sudan is, northern Nigeria, and Yemen, and some Somalia, I think, went to IPC 5 recently, where you're actually experiencing famine. And, because of global help, things changed a bit. IPC 5, that's famine. So extreme social upheaval with complete lack of food access and or other basic needs, where mass starvation, death, and displacement are evidence. So the idea and the work that we're doing in most of countries is we're trying to get people, first of all, to get out of 4, go in 3, and also if we can do even better, to go back to 1. That's where we're supposed to be. But I know Caritas, I know the Catholic Church through CRS has been very instrumental in putting this together. So it's a global agreed principle. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to give Diego the question on private sector. And Ambassador, Thailand is also working somewhat in Colombia, and he will also discuss working with other parties and with some reflection on what Thailand did in its own country. And then I think the question relating to the government, I would give to Caritas. Okay.
Well, thank you for your question. First, let me try to explain or unpack what voluntary substitution means and this is one of the provisions that we like that was introduced in the peace agreement. It's not necessarily that coca farmers could decide whether they wanted to substitute or not. It was still mandatory. But it was, again, recognizing their agency. It was showing their commitment to move from the illicit economy to the licit one. And that's one of the challenges that this government is posing in messaging. They are telling communities or sending a message that now they're not going to recognize those agreements. Well, they said that they will, but again, it's still not necessarily a concrete message that is resounding in these communities. So a lot of skepticism and fear are around these communities. That's what we've been hearing from the ground. Now, onto your question of private sector. Private sector has been historically or recently, over the last 10 years, thank you to USAID and other donors, engaging more in coca substitution processes. But these are top-bottom type of programs. They don't consult with farmers, they don't consult with communities, so these are preconceived packages that come from the private sector and are implemented in these communities. We have a good example and good partnership with the National Federation of Coffee, we'll say, that's the exact translation, which they resemble the way that coca is produced. Small plots of land with a lot of technical assistance and expertise needs to be provided. But again, that can sort of transmit their knowledge to the coca growers. So I will say that that's an interesting and a successful partnership. But again, the National Federation for Coffee is recognizing their capacity, is recognizing their needs, for instance, on land access and land rights. That's a key aspect to reduce coca, and is providing access and titling to those communities that depend on coca. That's the short answer.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I just would like to confirm that Thailand is working with the UN ODC, Office of Drugs and Crime, I think with Germany also, to support application of alternative development in Colombia. We have some experience. We have worked with Afghanistan, and in Thailand there are a number of organizations, mostly foundations set up under the Royal Project, and they know practical steps how to apply these. In Afghanistan, it's still a problem because, as you know, conditions there are such that sometimes you don't know who's in control, where, or who's in control when, and so those conditions are not as I know, not in Colombia now, so it should work. Thank you.
Okay,
Okay, the government question you made. Yes, we have some conversations with the government of Duque a few months ago, and he has like 3 priorities for the implementation of the peace accord. The first one is the reintegration process. The second one is the illicit crop substitution, and the third one are the territorial plans for development. That are the 3 main priorities of Duque's government. Still, we are in a change of government. We are adapting for a new government, so they are like reviewing everything they have done in the peace accord. But I think that these 3 main things are the things they are going to focus in the following 4 years of the government.
are there any other, we have one question there?
Thank you. I am Chhatra Amatya from Nepal. My question is to His Excellency. You said about the sufficiency economy model. I would like to know what exactly is that program and whether you have done it in Nepal also.
Absolutely. Our agency has been working for some time with Nepal to develop this thinking. Sufficiency economy is aimed at make sure that you are self-reliant. Self-reliant is not self-sufficient, because nobody can be self-sufficient. No country, nobody can be self-sufficient. But you can be self-reliant, and you can have resilience through that. When you go through a period of rain in your life, you come out of that with resilience. That's the aim. So you apply this in your everyday life, you apply this in your business, you apply it professionally. I'm available, my colleague over there, please stand up, is available for details on this. We would be glad to give you any details if you're interested. Thank you.
Other questions? Well, yes?
My name is Katerina Sira. I work at NYU's Peace Research and Education Program, and we're developing a joint diploma project with ISAP, the National Public Administration School. And so I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about the training programs you've done with SENA and maybe some of the formal or informal education programs you're doing, and kind of what you're seeing are the strengths of those and what are some good lessons learned.
I will pass that on. I think I'll just ask 2 questions. And to Rob, if you were going to go to Colombia, do you think that you could take your program as a training of trainers? Would that translate? And think about that. You can follow that question. And Massimo, we've talked a lot about dialogue and engagement. And in view of some of the insecurity in Colombia, how do you think that sort of this inclusive dialogue might address some of the insecurities that are taking place? Okay, so
I want to highlight like a model that had been used with the former combatants, that is from the Norwegian Consul, because most of the former combatants have left the school very child or never have gone to the school. So these programs try to adapt to the combatant. No, it's not the curriculum of all the schools in Colombia. It's a special curriculum made for the specific needs of the combatant. So maybe I can give you the link so you can search the curriculum and all the specification of this. Is a model between the Ministry of Education of Colombia and the Norwegian Council of Refugees in Colombia. That tried to do that like in a few years, have the most basic things that they need for their life, like lectures, writing, basic math things and all that. So with this, they then pass to the National Learning Center service to have some formation about technical, agricultural technical capacities and all that for the productive projects. That's more the model that we are using.
Yes, and also in other projects of Caritas, we have this model for non-informal education. So we are based in these 4 levels of relations, and we identify which are the things they need to strengthen. For example, we have a CSO of productive organizations, and we want to strengthen about accountability skills. So we identify these accountability skills, and we made some training with them, taking into account the schedule they can work with us. So most of the days are on weekends. And we try to do that, we try to identify these in order to make them strength internally so they can do things externally, like the productive production and all that. So we identify this by this way, but I think that's one of our own methodology we have applied in Caritas for these processes, specifically non-informal education.
Well, the National Learning System, as we call it, SENA, it's a government institution that offers vocational training to the general population. And we've been working with SENA in Cauca, a southern department, which is one of the departments that produces immense amounts of coca. So the learning process has been 2 ways. Firstly, is learning from the communities in the way that they were growing coca for self-consumption, for traditional uses, and what other uses they were giving to coca. SENA came with their trainers to the municipality, to those coca farmers, and start working in designing a curricula that could be offered to other areas, other coca growing regions in the country. So that's one concrete outcome that it's gonna be implemented as of next year, hopefully. On how to transform coca to illicit goods. The other learning was this overexcitement that we had at the beginning, that we thought we were going to be able to commercialize edibles massively and dignify and offer better income for these communities. We have to be cautious on that. We have to do a lot of research, so the research moment it's key to understand not only the market, but also what actual edibles you can produce out of coca. But the other positive learning is the fact that out of the fertilizers that were produced and developed thanks to the SENA, to the National Learning System, agricultural production for those families was reduced. The cost of production was reduced. And that's already a huge impact for these communities. And again, it's learning from the communities, jointly with the government, and being able to impact policy.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. One of them, I would tap into something Diego mentioned earlier, which is the idea that an external packaged response never feels good to me from a programmatic perspective. That kind of, we have an idea, so let's implement that idea in this space that we don't fully understand. All those threads are generative over time and sort of a vast array of programming. What I would hope is that in a process of engagement, there would be a few that could weave into the tapestry of existing on-the-ground community-focused efforts that would be able to help elevate those efforts.
Thank you, Yvonne, for your question. I think that we may draw a more general conclusion from the question you posed. As you know, one of the pillars of the peace agreement has to do with the political dimension and the political parties, so to speak. One can look at these in a formal institutional perspective, but we should consider that both in formal and informal ways, because there is a political participation dimension that is not captured by the working of formal institutions. So we may, of course, work on providing access and creating a platform for dialogue for political actors that are formally recognized. But what we heard here has a lot to do with the agency, the capacity of mobilize and organize at the grassroots level, and how that relates to the national politics. Let's not forget that many of these ex-combatants define themselves as combatants. In other words, they don't accept of being labeled as ex-combatants because they didn't lose the conflict. No? So they portray themselves as combatants. And the issue is how to transform the arena for political competition from a violent one to one that responds to the democratic rules of engagement. So that is the big issue. And in order to do that, I think we need basically to define and protect a space that is both ideal, abstract, is a space that can be accessed from different positions within the country, because some of these combatants leave the area and go back to other areas or maybe to urban areas. So what is their engagement in the political process from these different locations? And the other aspect is to protect a physical space in the areas that were the areas where the conflict took place. And there, the most critical issues have to do with very concrete elements that have been addressed here. Land, services, who accesses these, what is the presence of the state that should guarantee these services? Is it politicized in one way or another? So I think defining and protecting these spaces at these two levels is very important to build trust and confidence in the process.
Okay. Well, we're going to wrap up our workshop. I'd like to just point out that the focus of this workshop really was on conflict prevention and the transformation, and I think all of our speakers today really focused on these, what were the roots, what was the legacy of a conflict and how that can be transformed. And one of the sources have been in rural areas and agriculture and inclusiveness. So I wanted to thank very much the ambassador so much for coming and participating. Diego, Rob, who drove down from Vermont, and Massimo came from New York, Gabriel, Mario, and Juliana, who came from Bogota. And thank you for wherever you've come to participate in this workshop. Thank you so much.